All right, we want to welcome everyone back, and we're going to go ahead and move forward with our next speaker. Our next speaker will be Brendan Brazee. He's a state rangeland management specialist with the Idaho Natural Resources Conservation Service. And in that role, he is responsible for providing training and technical assistance to help planners working on land or working with landowners and partners to develop conservation plans and grazing strategies that address resource concerns, and coupled with that, landowner goals and objectives. So we're happy to have Brendan here with us today, and look forward to his presentation. He's going to be talking specifically today about drought and the effects of drought on rangeland health. I always find it interesting when we start to think about drought a little bit and plan some programs and things to address that. It always seems like that triggers a little better precipitation. So maybe we should do these more often just to help. I don't know. But so far we've been pretty fortunate, blessed to have some good precip across most of Idaho. So hopefully if we keep talking about it, that'll continue, and we'll be on to some good moisture for the coming year. So with that, Brendan, we're going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Scott. Let me see if I can get this thing shared here real quick. How's that?
Looks good.
Okay, so I got to talk about the drought effects on range health. Well, drought, like everything else, is kind of one of those disturbances that has some good and bad points to range health. Short-term drought usually results is a similar disturbance to grazing, actually, where it affects plant growth and production and makes producers adjust their timing and intensity of their grazing operations to maintain the health and vigor of those plants. Long-term drought is very similar to long-term improper grazing use, where you can start to affect composition and changes in plant community and introduction of invasive species and changes of all those ecological processes at once. So kind of what I like to talk about is kind of start with just kind of the basis of what we at NRCS look at as range health for sure. And it starts with kind of a definition. So what is rangeland? We define rangeland as lands on which the historic plant community is predominantly grasses, grass-like plants, forbs, or shrubs. This includes anything that was revegetated naturally or seeded, and when the routine management of that vegetation is accomplished mainly through the manipulation of grazing animals. Rangelands, of course, include all natural grasslands, savannas, shrublands, most deserts, tundra, alpine communities, coastal marshes, and wet meadows. So what about range health? We hear that a lot. Range health actually has a good definition. It is the degree in which the integrity of the soil, vegetation, water, and air, as well as the ecological processes of rangeland systems, are balanced and sustained. Our ecological process refers how energy and different forms of matter, including nutrients and water, move through components of an ecosystem. The function of these processes determines the capacity of the rangelands to support specific plant and animal communities, and in turn affects potential uses such as grazing, recreation, conservation, hunting, etc. Rangelands are considered healthy if the key ecological processes, the water cycle, the energy flow, and the nutrient cycle, are functioning within their normal range of variability. Let's see here. As you can kind of see up here, how this big picture system works from a kindergarten picture. We'll kind of go into those processes and kind of explain a little bit of how they work. And any disturbances such as drought, wildfire, grazing, mountain bikers, can disrupt those ecological processes, leading to the loss of the health and productivity of rangeland plant communities. So let's kind of go through each one of these processes. The water cycle is the first process to talk about. This kind of really refers to how precipitation moves through and is stored in different components of the ecosystem. This is including plants, animals, soils, streams, lakes, groundwater. If the water cycle is not functioning within its normal range, some consequences that happen are you can have surface erosion, both from wind and water. You can have flooding, reduced resilience to drought, which then affects other things such as changes in plant production. The energy cycle refers to how the conversion of sunlight is converted into plant and animal matter. All of the energy in an ecosystem that allows for the growth and development of organisms comes from the sun. The process of photosynthesis, plants convert a fraction of that energy into available molecules that can be used and nutrients that can be used by animals, carnivores, herbivores, decomposers within the system. The total plant biomass on a rangeland represents the amount of energy available for other organisms in the food chain. What's really interesting is the higher the diversity of plants, you can capture more energy through the growing season, providing greater capacity for the organisms above and below ground. When the energy flow is not functioning properly within that normal range, it can lead to poor plant growth, production, and reduced biological activity. The nutrient cycle, of course, refers to the cycling of nutrients such as nitrogen, phosphorus, through the physical and biotic components of the environment. The availability of these key nutrients helps determine the capacity of an ecosystem to support specific plant animal communities. These communities on sites that lose soil nutrients through erosion are less stable and less able to support biomass over time. And similarly, if you have excess nutrients in some sites, it can lead to undesirable changes such as increase in invasive species. Non-functioning nutrient cycles result in imbalanced soil fertility, increases in erosion, poor plant growth, increases in invasive plants that lead to changes in those plant communities. So when you're looking at range health, we want to be able to determine how those ecological processes are functioning. We do some ratings with range health indicators and attributes. So when you visit a site, you can usually observe the range health at that point in time. You can observe and rate the 17 different indicators, which all contribute to the attribute ratings for soil site stability, hydroelectric function, and biotic integrity. The clues and the tools that you observe while you're out at the site help you determine a rating. When you evaluate those indicators and compare them to what you would expect to see for each site, range health is really compared. We usually compare it to only one single ecological site. Each site has a specific function and expected outcome from each of the within each of the ecological processes. So attribute ratings give you an idea of how the processes are functioning in relation to reference conditions. So our first attribute, soil site stability, is the capacity of an area to limit the redistribution and loss of soil resources, including nutrients or organic matter, by wind and water. Mostly, it's a site's ability to resist erosion. This is very important when it comes to drought. Attribute 2 is hydroelectric function. This is the capacity of an area to capture, store, and safely release water from rainfall, runoff, snowmelt, and resist a reduction in this capacity and to recover it when a reduction does occur. During drought, our hydrologic function is limited. We have no water to capture and store, and so moisture resources do get used up, and the system has to be healthy enough to capture that moisture when it does come again. Numerous factors affect the hydrologic function. Soil texture, amount of cover, and each site is different. A sandy site, for instance, can infiltrate a lot of water if it has good cover, and it usually holds it pretty well. A clay site with a little less ground cover has a lot harder time infiltrating those small storms and capturing that water. So each site has a different rate at which it can do this. Soils, vegetation, and topography and precipitation all contribute to this attribute. And biotic integrity is the capacity of the community to support those processes within that normal range. The biotic community includes plants, animals, microorganisms, both above and below ground. And each ecological site consists of a unique set of these components, whether it's forbs, shrubs, grasses, trees in some cases, that represent a percent and amount of a typical functional and structural group that plays an important role, how the energy flows through the system, the nutrient cycles, and the hydrology affect how this all works. But what does all this mean? Mostly healthy rangelands are supported by those attributes of range health. And if you have the three legs of the stool connected, rangelands can be healthy if all of those processes, the water cycle, the energy flow, and the nutrient cycling are functioning within that normal range. When these ecological processes are functioning, they support specific plant and animal communities, which can in turn be used by everyone to meet their land use objectives. So when we do range health assessments, we're trying to indirectly evaluate how those processes are functioning and observing and rating those indicators and assigning an overall rating for the attributes of soil site stability, hydrologic function, and biotic integrity. It gives us an idea of how things are working and maybe whether we need to look at some different changes or improvements in our operations. The three attributes, of course, are interrelated and equally important, and drought can affect range health by disrupting one or more of these ecological processes. So what is drought? This is an interesting slide with showing just the last year, right? If you look over here, last January, we weren't looking too bad. Things were looking pretty good. There's actually no drought up north. A few little pockets are pretty good. Only one little red spot there in the Wood River Valley. And by September last fall, we were looking pretty ugly most of the way. Most of this is extreme drought, this dark red. All of the state was in drought. Most of the West was in drought. And I just pulled this the other day from the 4th, and we have some improvements, but we're not out of the woods yet, right? This is kind of what happened last year. We started off January pretty decent shape, and then it quit, right? No more rain, no more snow. And so drought is just a part of the West. Many of our rangelands evolved under drought conditions. And one of the old range cons told me when I first started that we're always one rainstorm away from a drought. And that kind of helps with some of the stuff that Terrell and Ashley were talking about, is how do I make my system more resilient and more adaptable so I can manage my way through these things, because they happen pretty often. Drought is always present and ever changing somewhere in the West. So there's some important definitions for droughts that I kind of want to go over with. There's a meteorological drought. This drought is often defined by periods of substantially diminished precipitation, duration, and/or intensity. We have a meteorological drought every summer. Here in Idaho, since I've been here, I've noticed that the rain spigot typically shuts off towards the end of May, first part of June, and nothing happens at all until October. That drought has some impacts on plant production, site stability, erosion potential, but it's a fairly common drought. It happens a lot. And so every year we have those little periods of drought. Agricultural drought, on the other hand, refers to when there's inadequate soil moisture to meet the needs of a particular crop. So on the rangeland, we're trying to grow grass. If we don't get our moisture at the right time or the right amount, we have a really hard time meeting the needs of those plants to grow. Hydrologic drought refers to deficiencies in the surface and subsurface water supplies. This is measured stream flow, snowpack, reservoir, groundwater levels, spring developments. These pictures up here are snow survey. So this is a hydrological drought right here. And then we get into socioeconomic droughts, where these physical water shortages start to affect the health and well-being and quality of life of people. And when the drought starts to affect supply and demand of economic products, that's happening over here in California. And so droughts have a huge impact, and range health contributes to some of that impact. So in order to determine some of the impacts of drought, you want to look at some local weather, climate data. The Drought Monitor is a good place to start. And the prediction centers. And you might even consider setting up your own weather station. I know at my house last year, I got just a little bit over 8 inches of precipitation total for the whole water year. And this year I'm already up to about 4. So I'm pretty happy right at the moment, but I'm getting a little concerned. As you can see, our outlook is getting a little bit better, right? We have some improvement in our drought, and we have a few areas where we might actually remove a little bit of a drought, but we have some areas where the drought is going to persist, it looks like. And this is just for January. So they update this thing every month and give us a new outlook. Sometimes to assess your site and field conditions with your weather data, you want to look at the estimating for soil moisture and soil survey. That kind of helps you get an idea of where your soil should be in terms of moisture and when you might want to start implementing some of your drought management plans. Soil moisture is a key component to grass growth. When that's gone, then negatively reduces your above and below ground production, reproductive opportunities, and long-term stability of the site. Drought leads to that loss of soil moisture available for plant growth, and in combination with other disturbances can lead to changes of those processes. And so this is a hard one to do, but I would Google this one. This is a guideline for estimating soil moisture. If you Google that, you'll get a little chart. This is based on your soil texture, your available water holding capacity for those soils, and a field test so you can kind of get an idea of where your soil moisture percentage falls into play. What about the timing? It really doesn't take a lot of rain to grow grass, but timing is everything. There was an old study that was done in Wyoming that correlated the timing of precip to determine the impacts of annual forage production. So this is a 10 to 14 inch zone, or excuse me, over by Saratoga. And they run this study for 14 years. They measured precip, timing, amounts, temperatures, along with total production. And what they came up with is that April precipitation is the most important in setting that production. If it only rained in April, then they could grow grass. Now I expect that timing to change maybe a little bit here, a little bit there, but kind of keep your eye on it. Watch when it rains, watch what your production does for the year. We've had a couple of good years, as Ashley pointed out, where we didn't have a lot of drought according to the precipitation. We had some drought based on timing, and if you looked even 2 years ago out in the desert, some of the early season grasses, basin wild rye, crested wheatgrass, Russian wild rye, they were reduced in their total production because the timing of the rain came a little later. Blue bunch and sandberg bluegrass and Thurber's nealgrass did fine because they were okay with that rain that happened in May, but they didn't get any of that early rain. So this study kind of helps clarify how that soil moisture is important during those critical growth periods of grasses. And if you have adequate soil moisture, you can have new root growth, which can begin prior to the initiation of the basal bud and the above ground growth supply of moisture and nutrients. So how does grass grow? All right. Like all plants, grasses need solar energy, water, and nutrients to grow. Each year, growth initiates from a normal basal bud when the temperature is around 40 degrees and there's adequate soil moisture. That's a key ingredient. As the temperature warms in late May and early June, your rapid growth phase occurs and prepares that plant for reproduction. Most of our cool season grasses, which is what we have as dominants, finish setting seed and begin storing carbohydrates and root shedding as they prepare for summer dormancy as those temperatures get warmer. Cooler temperatures and fall precipitation, the roots can grow rapidly and next year's buds form and some regrowth occurs of existing tillers. So what happens during a drought? During a drought, we start the spring off with a limited amount of moisture to start that bud formation. Root growth usually starts well before the leaves start growing, and if there's not moisture there, it can't grow. And so then you start to affect buds and tillers, growth slows down, growth becomes stagnant, plants go dormant much quicker, and they don't have the opportunity to replace the roots that are lost each year. This is one of my favorite pictures of the world. This is what our forest looks like underneath the rangeland. When you turn this picture the other way, it is really difficult to focus on the root system. So I turn it upside down so you can really see what we're trying to achieve underground. So, like I said before, root growth starts well beyond the defined growing season if there's moisture and temperatures that are in that suitable range. If you have carbohydrates and nutrients which are stored in the stem, right? Roots begin early in the spring, and at this time it's almost totally dependent on stored carbohydrates, and those stored carbohydrates are in the bottom 2 to 3 inches of each grass stem. Root growth is often suppressed during periods of rapid growth due to energy demand. Once that plant reaches a 3 to 5 leaf stage, it starts to become energy efficient and storage can start to occur, but it's using up a lot of energy to grow new grass tillers and new leaf growth. Once that plant reaches maturity, seeds set, the roots start to grow again. And this is as long as there's still some green leaves and photosynthetic capacity left. Root growth can continue in the fall and winter as long as conditions remain favorable and resources exist. This is one of the things we missed last year. Some of our plants just started growing in August. we had the one big rainstorm, things started happening. And we had some moisture in the fall, things started happening that hadn't happened all summer. And so resiliency is really key here. So if you're looking at managing the roots of your plant, you want to manage your time and timing of your grazing and how much you should put on it. Because roots are a key component of annual production. And the below ground biomass can be 3 to 4 times higher than that of above ground biomass on healthy plants, and account for 50 to 80% of your total annual production. And on average, just for good information, is that these grasses replace, oops, sorry about that. The grasses replace about 30% of the roots each year. Healthy root systems provide for resilience and resistance to an individual plant as well as the ecosystem they're part of. More roots you have in the ground, the more organic matter you can accumulate, the higher the infiltration rate, the higher the water holding capacity of these soils, which makes it more resilient to drought situations. So when you look at roots, grazing and drought have very similar impacts, although the timing is a little bit different. That take half, leave half rule is still important, right? This grazing philosophy has a basis in scientific fact. It's been determined that the effect of roots by the removal of leaves through grazing is negligible up to about 50%. Once that 50% is reached on your utilization, roots pretty much stop growing. You can have some serious damage to that root system, and that in turn leads to loss of health and vigor of that plant. For example, if 60% of the leaf volume is removed, as much as 50% of your root growth is stopped. And during a drought year, that 50% is super important because it's only a minimal amount. It's already limited because of lack of available moisture. So grazing during a drought takes a little bit of massaging and thought processes to get through it and not have a whole lot of damage to your rangelands. So if you only remove the upper leaf blades of a grass tiller, the effect on the regrowth and the root biomass is very small. Grazing removes a significant portion of that leaf and sheath area. Some of the stored carbohydrates and protein are also removed, which then limits the amount of that plant to produce a new bud and tiller from that other thing. Drought induces similar impacts. Soil moisture limits that ability to replace those roots lost by slowing and stopping growth. So, although grasses evolved and are adapted to use by grazing animals and drought, believe it or not, multiple grazing events can occur before the plant is fully recovered. Then that results in root biomass loss. And that reduces the area within the soil profile that the plant has access to moisture and nutrients. This in turn, of course, leads to reduction of above ground growth and reduced carbohydrates, which further limits root production. Kind of repeating myself over and over, but this is kind of important. We want to manage the roots. If you lose the roots, your overall plant vigor and health leads to reduction of the range and soil health attributes and functioning of those ecological processes. So how do we address this? Because we're always in a drought, right? And so look at your operation and prioritize your goals and objectives. Try to maintain the value and equity of your operation, prevent long-term damage to range health and productivity, and keep the integrity of your herd intact. Short-term objectives, you want to maintain plant health and promote healthy root systems and leaf material that can take advantage of the moisture when it does come. Remember, take half and leave half and adjust your recovery times. When you utilize things during drought, it takes a longer period of time to recover. Normally, most folks have a pretty decent rotation that works well during a normal year. During a drought year, you need to adjust and manage that rotation so you can maintain that plant health over time and do what you can to keep your operation intact. So when the drought breaks, that recovery can occur. Long-term objectives should maintain your ecosystem and watershed health by monitoring, adjusting your grazing strategies, getting additional forage resources, maybe reducing numbers, and trying to maintain your plant residues on the surface to minimize erosion and create an opportunity to recover. High grazing demands on drought-stressed plants can affect the health, vigor, and productivity of your desirable forage species. This can lead to invasion of less productive, unpalatable, and even poisonous plants. Addressing the damage caused by drought and inadequate management can be time-consuming, difficult, and expensive. So monitor and adaptively manage your operation to meet your desired outcomes. Talked a little bit about it before, right? Carol talked about water developments in spring. So as you look at drought proofing your operation, increasing that grazing distribution and allowing you access to all of the forage available to you is a great tool, because when you do that, that allows you to add more rest and recovery time to other portions of the ranch. And you can always get assistance from some of the programs to help install infrastructure, water developments, springs, pipelines, tanks, troughs, wells, as well as some assistance for forage losses and supplemental feeding. So remember, the keys to your drought planning are to set conservative ranch strategies and insulate yourself. You don't set your stocking rates and your carrying capacity on your best year, right? If you set your stocking rates and carrying capacity based on the production that is produced on your operation during the dry year, you're somewhat buffered, insulated, and you can take advantage of those other resources on good years by, getting additional, adding yearlings, sheep, leasing out some pasture, whatever you need to do. But your permanent operation should be set on that minimum production that's available. Set your resource objectives. Healthy rangelands that are functioning, minimal erosion, good hydrology, good site stability, good diversity really help insulate and make your sites more resilient. Anticipate, watch for those signs. I start watching for drought in October. I'm looking for some moisture in the fall that helps me. This is the first year in 5 years we've had cheatgrass germinate at my house. So I take that as a good sign and a bad sign both. That I have cheatgrass as a problem, that it germinated actually gives me a sign that there's some moisture that we had available. Watch your weather, watch the anticipated things. Start to make your decisions early. If you start to sharpen your pencil and think of your strategies now of what you're going to do, what's plan B, what's plan C, D, E, and F, all the way through, you can always slow down and go back. But it's really hard if you make that decision too late to catch up and recover. Make your decisions early, right? And be proactive in your monitoring and managing the access to your range grasses. Be adaptable and flexible. That's the most important part. So I want to leave you guys with a couple of quotes here. When you're developing a grazing strategy and plan, this is not new. This has been around for years and years and years. And so this is a quote from Arthur Sampson in 1913. And this is: to graze a permanent pasture closely from the time that growth begins until it ceases will soon result in decreasing its carrying capacity and eventually depleting it. some of these ideas that we have are not new. These have been around for many, many years. And one that's kind of important in our drought condition. So this is from Dr. Dijkhuis back in the day. And this is: a man who has a short pasture needs a rain much worse than his neighbor who has ample forage on the range. But when the rain comes, it will do the least good for the fellow who needs it the most. And I hope that makes sense. So if you're managing, so you're leaving residual cover, you have some grasses in good shape, when the rain comes, your ground is able to absorb that and take advantage of that moisture. When you get into those overgrazed, heavily used areas, that rain that comes doesn't help as much as it should. Okay, I hope that helped a little bit. Maybe confused everyone, maybe not. But if you have any questions, I'll be more than happy to answer you. Thank you.
Thank you, Brendan. We do have a couple of questions that have been dropped in the chat. And the first one is, do you know the reference, or do you have the reference for that?
The moisture one?
Moisture, well, whatever, the volume of plant material removed versus root growth.
Which one? Oh, on the root growth?
Yeah, the 50,
this one here?
No, I think maybe it's the next slide after that. Yeah, right there. So
this one here?
Yes.
Gosh, this one's been around for years. I mean, it was in the old Range and Pasture Handbook. I've seen this one my whole life, and it's in lots of things. I can find it and put a copy of it. This fits the key pretty well. This is, volume of leaf removed. When you hit that 50%, this really does stop. It's amazing. And this is a good picture. Let me see if I can get this to get a little bigger here. Can you guys still see that?
We can. So yeah, we're seeing like your tile slide.
Okay, let me get back down to the other one. And I do have a couple other pictures of this one. But let me get my pointer here. So this picture right here is from Texas, and I have one that is from Colorado, I think, that has sedges, and another one that I found that has another blue stem, I think. But this is just an experiment they did in a grow box. And so this first one was grazed down to 9 inches. This is a little blue stem. And so this was grazed to 9 inches every 90 days. And that's a little less than half, right? 9 inches on a little blue stem is close to 50%. And this is grazed down to 4 inches every 90 days. And this one is grazed to 9 inches every 30 days. And you can see the differences in that root growth. This one here, why is the root growth so well here compared to this one that's grazed a lot shorter? And that is an effect of shading and removal of that overstory. Little blue stem especially is one that is, its growth form, the old stems will stand up there and they will actually shade the new tillers. New tillers come out along the outside edge and shade the old stems, shade it so there's not getting enough sunshine. This one, where it was moved down to 50%, had access to all the sunlight it wanted. It had available moisture, and it did grow more roots. And this is an ungrazed. You can tell that these roots are a little bit longer, but the density is not quite as much.
Yeah. And then kind of, to that aspect, I mean, you mentioned that you'd seen that chart forever. And I actually had somebody ask me that same question. I used that in a presentation, and they asked me the same question. And so I started diving into, where did this come from? Karen Launchbaugh posted a deal in the chat, a reference dating back to 1961 out of the Canadian Journal of Plant Science. And I would say I've got you beat, Karen, because in my research trying to ferret that out, I went back to it's a Soil Conservation Service Technical Bulletin 1102, root growth stoppage resulting from defoliation of grass. That one's dated 1955. And so anyway, somewhere between those two, that they contain the information that evolved into this one chart that has been used over and over again. So, but it took me a long time of searching before I found the reference that I did. Yeah,
I'll have to check. I think it might be in the. Gosh, I have a copy of the old 1938 Range and Pasture Handbook. I'll look in that one. I know it's in the 50s one.
Yeah. And then a different question than Dr. Sprinkle asked this one. So the spring following drought, if we wait until 4 or 5 leaf stage for grazing, will that aid in recovery?
It does. I would try. I mean, ideally, and this is the problem, it's an imperfect world and we can't rest and let things recover at all at once, right? We would not have anywhere to take our animals. So the longer you can rest, I would let it get almost to, I would let it get past the 3 to 4 leaf stage if you can. And that's where kind of a rotation is really important. You might be able to rest some of it till seed set. Maybe some of it you're resting in that late boot stage. Maybe some of it you can rest till it's dormant and minimize your use on this stuff that's not quite ready. Because even though it looks recovered, above ground it may look fantastic, but that root system hasn't had time to restore itself yet. When it gets shut off, it takes a while to get growing again. And then if we're locked in because of lack of moisture and drought conditions, the roots that sloughed off the previous layer still have to replace. So instead of replacing 30%, you might have to replace 40 or 50% of that root biomass to get back to where you were. So it takes a little bit longer.
Awesome. I think that's let me look just to be sure, but anyway, I think that's all the questions that we had. There were a couple of links. Jim Sprinkle and Karen Launchbaugh each posted some links as far as references back to what we've been talking about there. And so anyway, for those that might be interested, there's some links there. With that, I think we're right at about our lunch break.